Should you consider using Mulan in 2024 and beyond? Well, in this video, we'll walk through where she's strong, where she's weak, and why she still sees use every single day in the top tier Canyon teams. So in this video, we'll give you everything you need to know if you're thinking about putting sculptures into Mulan. Hello my friends and welcome back. I'm Chisgule Gaming, and today's video is sponsored by the makers of Rise of Kingdoms. And I've been playing Rise of Kingdoms for over 2,000 days, collecting the overwhelming majority of the commanders in the game. I mention this because I've used the overwhelming majority of these commanders in many different configurations and also tested them in many different configurations. So this video is both going to be a summary of the half dozen or so videos I've done testing Mulan, and also is going to help new players understand, like, hey, should I be working on Mulan or not? And the short answer is that although she is going to be really strong in the early game, in the open field, you have an alternative, and that is very simply the Epic Joan. Now, as we're going to talk about in this video, Mulan is actually better than the Epic Joan, and there's a number of reasons why that's the case. In fact, she is so much better than Epic Joan that if I go to my Canyon lineup, every single top tier team is using Mulan, even though they aren't necessarily going to be using Mulan in the open field. In fact, the overwhelming majority of players do not use Mulan in the open field, even though every top Canyon team is going to have her. And several of the accounts that are being showcased here have spent over $200,000 on Rise of Kingdoms. Heck, my account, I'm over $130,000. Just for perspective, I'm probably well on my way to $150K in the game. So, with all that said, let's talk about what makes Mulan tick. Why is she good? Why do people use her? And then we'll talk about why it is that she doesn't see most endgame open field play, all right? So the thing that's really crazy about Mulan is, I'll say, obviously her active skill. For the next 3 seconds, up to 5 nearby allied or friendly troops, including this commander's troop, get 20% attack, defense, and health, and gain 30% march speed. Now, the way this buffing works is it will always prioritize her march first, then 4 nearby marches that are yours, ideally. So this means that your marches, when you bring 5 or more to the open field, are getting buffed like crazy. From here, the next skill is also very powerful, 5% less damage taken, and whenever you're hit with a basic attack, that is when someone directly targets you, it has a 20% chance to reduce their rage by 100 with a 5-second internal cooldown. This also is really powerful. And for those of you newer to the game, the way that rage works in this game is surprising. Let me explain very briefly. There is a hidden rage limit in Rise of Kingdoms. The most rage you can gain in one turn is 220. Now, anything that would put your rage over 220 doesn't do it. So all buffs to rage, you add it all up, whatever your rage is, if it would have been over 220, it gets reduced down to 220. From there, rage reduction effects are applied. So even if someone generates extra rage, that doesn't offset a rage reduction. So if someone was going to generate exactly 100 rage in a turn, but they were attacking Mulan, there's a 20% chance that instead they will produce 0 rage, which is actually really crazy. Rage reduction effects in this game are very good. Now, unfortunately, less good is this skill over here, generating experience. 95% more experience for the primary and secondary commander. This is great when you're leveling up in the game, but really bad if you're in the end game and want to use her in the open field. It's a dead skill. And finally, the fourth skill makes it so that you get 20% attack, and when this commander uses an active skill while serving as the secondary commander, it increases the target's damage received by 20% for 3 seconds. And there's a cooldown of 5 seconds on this. So this skill is probably the most underrated on Mulan. Making a target take 20% more damage from all sources is huge as a debuff. It is arguably one of the best debuffs in the game. Making a target take more all damage is an amazing debuff. Now, the thing that is tricky about Mulan is a part of the reason her active skill is as good as it is because of her expertise. So it goes from making her buff 2 seconds and 15% of all stats and 25% march speed to 3 seconds and 20% of stats and 30% march speed. This is way more important than it might look. It is approximately a 50% increase. It is a 50% increase in the duration of the buff, and it also elevates the stat boost, which is huge. So, in fact, what does this qualify as? You've got 15% attack, 15% defense, 15% health, and you're basically getting 5% more of all of these. So that's like another 15% in total. So it's like a 1/3 buff to stats. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but the point I'm trying to make is this is a commander you actually do want to expertise, because the expertise does meaningfully change how much value you get from this commander. Now, that said, Mulan is available from gold keys, and there's good news, bad news, folks. For commanders that are available from gold keys, you can get a lot of them. I have found with my gold keys, and I have opened a shocking amount of gold keys. I have 6,400 gold keys almost, just kind of chilling right now. And I'm waiting for a new civilization to drop, because when new civilizations drop in the game, typically they add a legendary commander to the gold keys. And I've maxed all the gold key commanders on this account. But that brings me to the problem. The problem with using sculptures into Mulan, if you are interested in her, is that eventually you'll max her. And when you do, every time you pull her from a gold key, you get no value. Those sculptures are worth nothing after they're maxed. And they're so valuable as you go to max them, right? The thing I will also point out is that I feel like Mulan's drop rate is dramatically lower than gathering commanders. I don't know that I have the data to prove that conclusively, but I think that although visually you would say, oh, like equal chance of all these commanders, no. Mulan drop rate has to be way lower, or I've been getting absurdly unlucky. I think the drop rate is lower. I do think that her drop rate is commensurate with other damage-dealing commanders like Mehmed or Ragnar or Thutmose or Pyrrhus, but much lower than the gathering commanders. Gathering commanders seem to drop at double rate over all the other commanders. But where am I going with this? The point I'm trying to make here is that after you max out a commander, their sculptures are worth nothing to you. So I have how many sculptures into Mulan? 486 extra sculptures just sitting in my inventory, adding no value whatsoever. The point I'm trying to make is that I would not recommend using universal legendary commander sculptures on Mulan. Compared to all the other commanders you could go and invest in, even if you're picking a gold key commander, I would say Charles Martel or Mehmed will be a higher priority for a universal legendary commander sculpture in the early game than Mulan. So how do you get value with Mulan in the early game? I'll say a couple things. And by the way, if you are getting value from this video, consider smashing a like on here and subscribing to the channel. The way you get value with Mulan in the early game is to unlock the first skill, of course, max it. Then, of course, unlock and work toward maxing the second skill. From there, take her to 4 stars and go and hopefully have skill points land on the final skill, that is the 4th skill. So you want to try to create a 5-5-1-1 initially. That represents the skill strength and the skill order. So 5-5-1-1. And then from there, ideally it would be 5-5-1-5, but that's obviously a gamble. You'll maybe get there, maybe you won't. And if you are newer to the game, there is a cool little function called skill lock. You can go in and hit this little cog over here, and you can control where skill ups go. So you can see when I slide to the left, the skills to the right lock up. So you basically want to leave it in this locked state as you unlock more of her skills until you max the first skill, do that, then max the second, and then take the slider all the way to the 4, and then you hope that you land on the 4th skill, okay? Now, Mulan is also kind of curious. If you're a newer player to the game, you are probably low on gold stars, and I have great news for you. Mulan's 4th skill makes it so that she is going to do more for you if she's the secondary commander. The all damage debuff here, I told you, was one of the most important things she's doing, and you get half the strength of the all damage debuff just by unlocking the skill. So you absolutely want to use her as the secondary, which means you don't have to spend stars taking her to 5 or 6 stars. You should not do that. Use other peacekeepers as the primary commander to go and level up your other commanders as an example. So some people go and they put more stars into Mulan. You have absolutely no need to do that. I basically have bottomless stars on this account, and I still haven't even bothered to star her up. There's no need to do it. There really is absolutely no need to take her past 4 stars. So don't do it, at least at the time of this recording, all right? You don't need her to be the primary. You want her to be the secondary. You absolutely want her to be the secondary. Now, in terms of her buff quality, where does it sit? Well, I did testing in a prior video. I'll have a card up in the top. And if I remember my testing correctly, Mulan maxed out did better than a Joan maxed out. Now, there's some nuance to that, and you could make some arguments one way or another. But the point I'm trying to make here is that I think the Mulan buff is better than the Joan buff. A better question might be, is an unmaxed Mulan buff better than a max Joan buff? But I don't have the answer to that offhand. The other thing that I'll point out is that testing I did in a different video, and I'll have a card up in the top and in the end screen, so you can go check this out, is that using Mulan as a secondary in a buffing march did better than using Ethelfled for damage, and this was 5v5 murder ball testing. It did better than Herald, which was a damage commander, and it did, I believe, better than an all-damage murder ball. So what I'm trying to say is that support actually does work well in fights where you're going to run it down versus the enemy. And we know this is true because of Canyon. Mulan is a staple in Canyon, as I mentioned. And the reason she's a staple in Canyon is because you're going to just sit there and run it down. So here's where Mulan is strong. When you fight an enemy and you just battle all the way down until all your marches are dead, and you do have 5 marches nearby. Mulan is not as good in situations where you don't have at least 5 marches, in situations where the enemy is running away and often seconds of her buff are wasted. In those situations, you would rather have done instant big skill damage to the enemy, and okay, fine, they run away a second later. Who cares? You already got your damage in. So overall, I would say that Mulan is better in these game modes like Canyon, in also Golden Kingdom, than she ends up actually being in most open field fights. So that's why you'll see Mulan here. And look, if Mulan's role in giving these buffs was bad, she wouldn't be here. She wouldn't be here. And let's talk about a part of the reason why she's here. In the end game, you're going to get a buff from something called the Museum. This is something that's available in KVK Season 3 and beyond. And Mulan has a buff that's really nuts. 20% health, 15% less skill damage taken. Again, this is only available to you once you get to the end game. And if you're using her in Canyon, which you should, it is nuts. 20% health, 15% skill damage reduction. It's actually at the first tier of the buff, 10% health and 10% skill damage taken reduction. Still really a big deal. Now, this buff doesn't really make her meta in the open field in the end game, but she is still pretty good. And there is one thing I will talk about that's underestimated about Mulan, and that is the value of the march speed. So we haven't even talked about march speed. Mulan is meta in Canyon, and she doesn't need to march anywhere. She's not going anywhere. You're mostly just running it down. So this 30% march speed, where is it valuable? It is valuable when you're running away, and it is valuable when you're chasing an enemy. So I just finished saying, does it really matter if you have all these buffs, but an enemy is running away? Well, good news. If you are chasing them, they are not getting away because you will go faster than them. And if you need to run away, you will go faster than your enemy if you use your active skill and you start running. And the defensive stats when your ball is running is also pretty good. So overall, I think Mulan is powerful, but obviously not meta. And what's weird about Mulan and what has made her weaker over time is the way that stats work in this game. The way that stats work in this game is that there is actually a diminishing return. So if you're subscribed to the channel, you already know this, and I've done a ton of testing, but I'll have a card up top talking about why it is, via testing, we have proven there is diminishing returns on stats the more you get. In other words, for each additional stat point you get less benefit the higher total stats you have. Now, something in the game has changed since I did the testing that makes Mulan less exciting, but she's obviously still used in Canyon, despite the fact that this is in the game. And this thing I'm referring to is the formation system. Through the formation system, you can expect top tier players with the best sort of sets to be pulling down at least 30% more stats. So the more stats you have, the less valuable more stats are. And so Mulan loses a little bit of effectiveness, but obviously not so much that we would take her out of Canyon. So she's like still really powerful in that context. This, of course, brings us to what are some good pairings for Mulan? If you're using her as a secondary, then my recommendation would be to put her behind a commander like, for example, if you have him, Richard I. Richard I doesn't really care who the secondary is. Mulan works great there. I have experimented with that in the past. I think it's fine. You could put your Mulan behind Charles Martel. That's a common tactic. The only thing I dislike about that is that Charles is boosting your all damage. Would be pretty cool to have a secondary that does big damage afterwards. So not amazing that you're not really getting the benefit of some big damage. You can put Mulan behind many of these epic commanders. I mean, as long as they're not a big skill damage commander, you can go ahead and do that. So for Canyon, for example, you could use Skippy as a choice that would work. In the open field, you could do Herman primary and Mulan secondary. The advantage there is that you're going to be generating extra rage, the fourth skill, which means more frequent activations of Mulan's buff to everyone, which is really good. You could do, as a secondary to Sun Tzu, I don't like, because Sun Tzu is boosting your skill damage, but secondary to Olji Mundak or Kusunoki would be fine. In my perfect world, though, because Mulan has no march speed, you want to put her behind someone that has that march speed. So I actually really like that Herman as a better option. At the legendary tier, there are a couple other options that would be worth mentioning, but they're uncommon. Like, you could put her behind El Cid. You could put her, I mean, if you had a leadership set, I guess it could be behind Mehmed, but he boosts skill damage. Honestly, it's like kind of weird. Thutmose would be okay. I just feel like, for the most part, if you're in the early game, just have better pairings for all those commanders, honestly. One common approach is to use Saladin primary and Mulan as a secondary, although often you'd prefer to just use Ethel instead. And I really like the Saladin. That actually, in the early game, might be one of my top picks, although in the end game, Saladin's going to fall off from relevance, and he's only really available in like KVK Season 2. So it's kind of a weird situation for who would you even pair Mulan with in the early game. I don't like pairing with Caesar. I suppose you could do Freddy, but I don't love it. You can hear my hesitation in the overwhelming majority of these pairs. I feel like the best place for Mulan in the very early game is if you run, for example, an Ethelfled Mulan march and you're using mixed troops. She doesn't particularly care about having mixed troops, though, so you don't have to do that. Or, alternatively, if you're using Richard or Charles Martel, and you kind of hide her behind there, it's a very tanky march. The enemy hits it, they're really not getting anything done. Those may be some of your best bets for early game pairings, but you can really hear my hesitancy. At the epic tier, I guess I'll give that head nod again to Herman because of the rage generation, and the march speed means more Mulan buffs. I like all of that. That's actually pretty good. And the utility here of this silence is pretty cool. He reduces the enemy's rage. This is Herman. The original is actually better than he gets credit for. A couple epic commanders you may have noticed I didn't mention include Pericles, who gives infantry units in their troop a march speed boost after they use their active skill. Well, that's not going to stack with Mulan, so you're not interested in potentially pairing them. I mean, it might be okay, but I don't think so. And Emotep also needs to be the secondary in order to get big value here. Only does this rage reduction if the commander is serving as the secondary commander. So I wouldn't recommend Emotep either. Pyrrhus is actually, we didn't talk about Pyrrhus. At the legendary tier, Pyrrhus will be pretty dang legit, actually. This is actually pretty legit. A lot of strength in this march. I actually think a Pyrrhus would be a very solid candidate. Pyrrhus primary, Mulan secondary for an open field march. You'll have plenty of other infantry, though, that you would consider pairing with Pyrrhus. In the end game, it's pretty straightforward. Like if you're using Mulan, it's Trajan Mulan, and that's just for Canyon, and it's not for the open field. You can use Trajan Mulan in the open field, but I will point out that Mulan really can go behind any commander that doesn't care about elevating skill damage. But just to give an example, you could do Joan Prime as the primary, legendary quality here, and as the secondary, you could do Mulan. And I don't think there's anything in here. Like, we're not actually boosting our skill damage, are we? So there's like ways you could sneak her in as a secondary, and it'd be better than you'd think. And like, she's a support commander, so like not heavy focus on skill damage. You could do that. I just get a little bit anxious. Like, you could do this with Skippy Prime as well. Skippy Prime, Mulan secondary. You could sneak her in. But I just don't think for the open field that's where it's at. I think you've got better choices. These days, the skill damage factor is so high. I think generally speaking, people are moving more and more in the direction of all damage murder balls rather than having a support march at all. So the overall summary here for Mulan is that she is a powerful commander in Rise of Kingdom, but not one that I would use universals on. I would take her to 5/5/1/1, and I would try to do that almost exclusively through gold keys. And I know you're thinking, bro, by the time I've done that, I'm already going to be in the end game. But good news for you. In my restart account, which is weaker than this one, and I spend primarily just on recharge events on that account and on crystal technology. That's an end game mechanic, crystal technology. We don't need to cover that here. I'll have a card up in the top if you want to learn more about it, though. But the point I'm trying to make is that I use Mulan in Canyon. I would say it made my team much better, and I used her 5/5/1/1 and it not maxed out. And eventually I got more skills on her, and eventually she got maxed out. And so now I'm using a max Mulan on that Canyon lineup. But even at a low skill level, she's going to do great in Canyon. And I would recommend using her. I would not, however, recommend using Mulan and Joan. And this is an important thing. If you're getting value from this video, smash that like button and a subscribe on here. For newer players to the game, you may not be aware that active skills will stack with talents and with passive skills. But active skills do not stack with other active skills. This means that if you use Joan and Mulan, although you will get the benefit of the rage buff here, and that is very powerful, the stat buffs over here will not exactly stack. In fact, they will overwrite part of the Mulan buffs. So your infantry, instead of getting the 20% Mulan health, will get 30% from Joan, but they will not get 50%. It doesn't add them up. So although having both commanders, especially if their skill cycles are off from each other, can still give you a fair amount of value, I don't think you necessarily want both of them. And that's a reason, in part, that endgame accounts aren't using both of them. I think if you have an early game account, maybe you could use both in a game mode like Canyon, and you might find that it works well. You'd have to test it, but I don't expect that it would. And when we tested this a very long time ago, we did not find the gain from using Mulan and Joan to be particularly strong. A lot has changed in the game since that time, though. So keep in mind that active skills will not stack with other active skills. And active skills will stack with other passive skills and buffs. So as an example, Trajan boosts your skill damage dealt and gives you rage per second. And this completely stacks with everything that Mulan is doing. There's no overwriting with the benefits that they're giving to all your marches, which is really powerful. So all in all, Mulan, powerful commander. Don't use universal legendary commander sculptures on her. Do use her in your Canyon lineup. Probably don't use her in the open field. However, unless you're maybe in the early game and you get an insane amount of Mulan pulls from your gold keys, but feels unlikely to me, you're probably better off with damage commanders instead of Mulan, especially if you have less than 5 marches. And this is maybe the final thing that we'll talk about, is that although it is cool to buff your friends, you might buff a friend's march that's not even hitting an enemy. Now, with Mulan, at least you're giving march speed. Like, it's not as bad as you might think. It's actually not quite as bad as you might think, but, you know, giving a bunch of stats and buffs to marches that are running away from the enemy instead of toward the enemy, kind of debatable. But you know that if you have 5 marches hitting the same thing, at least all your marches are enjoying the benefit of this buff, all right? Now, if you're looking for more information about Mulan versus Joan, all of those cards I promised in the end screen. You also can hit the info button to get the full range of videos that I referenced in this one. Smash that subscribe button if you enjoyed this. I've been making beginner guides about this game for 5+ years. So consider searching up anything you're looking for about the game with a YouTube search, Chisgule, and then whatever your question is, you'll probably find your answer. Until next time, you have fun smashing the kingdom.